of the governance system and to talk about some short-term and long-term issues raised by this dissolution. So thanks for being here.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Steve Boylard, Director of Higher Education with LAO. And thanks for the opportunity to address this issue. As you acknowledge, it's something that is quite critical to our higher education system. What I'd like to do is just quickly go through a brief history of how we got to where we are,
sure,
and then talk some about the short-term and the longer-term issues. So, by way of history, as you know, CPEC's an outgrowth of the master plan. The master plan had recognized a need for state-level coordination, and I think it emphasized that as something that was critical. And when we say coordination, I think it's important to see that as an umbrella term. It's not just the kind of collaboration of working together and making sure things work smoothly, which is part of it, but I think it extends to the idea of statewide planning as we think of what kind of programs or campuses do you put in place, to the allocation of resources among the segments or within the segments, or between enrollment growth and COLA, different kinds of functions. It would extend to data collection and analysis to be able to be sure that we're working towards the kind of goals the state requires. But I think there's really two key principles that the master plan recognized with regard to coordination, and I think that the legislature has supported this. One is that system-wide coordination is necessary to ensure the higher education system works effectively and efficiently towards the addressing of state needs. And second, that to some extent, this coordination has to have an element of independence from any of the individual segments. So there is a state level of interest that can be seen as a distinct view from just looking at the sum of the individual segmental interests. But what I want to emphasize on that is that independence doesn't mean that all you have is you put all your eggs in the basket of a statewide entity like CPEC that carries out your coordination function. That in addition, coordination involves the segments in working with one another. It involves the legislature in setting policy and oversight. It involves the governor. Guess what I would argue is we're all responsible for coordination in some way or another. We wouldn't put all just in the CPEC basket. But that said, there is a need for an entity to carry on part of that task. So, as you know, the Donahoe Act had created originally a coordinating council for higher education. It had majority representation by the segments. It had pretty limited authority. It was purely an advisory body. And for the first decade, I think that coordinating council and generally coordination seemed to work pretty well as the master plan was kind of rolling out. But when the first joint committee was convened in the early 1970s, it found, and I just read a sentence from it, their report said, after more than a decade under the celebrated master plan, California has no comprehensive state plan, no statewide planning process, no comprehensive information system to provide policymakers with accurate and comparable data on programs, costs, and the flow of students. So again, that was something that was written around 1971, 1972 by the Joint Committee, and I think maybe some of those points might sound very familiar today. So the Joint Committee also found that the absence of statewide planning had left the growth and development of higher education largely up to the segments, and have found this to be somewhat inefficient and not conducive to the achievement of state interests. So in 1973, the Coordinating Council was replaced by CPEC, and again, this now had a majority of public members. It had somewhat more authority, modestly enhanced authority, including being able to require certain data from the segments and a larger statewide planning function. However, subsequent reviews of the master plan that we've seen in the 80s and 90s into the 2000s have continually found the coordination in this system is inadequate. It has found that the transfer function in particular has been ineffective, and again I think recently we've seen some real progress on that as a result of SB 1440, but still the history has been transfer has been a pretty poor mechanism. Some mission creep among the segments. Again, the master plan originally really tried to stake out very specific missions to the three segments, and there's been some blurring of those lines. The reports have found insufficient data, that we haven't really been able to know how our costs are allocated and what kind of performance we've been seeing from our segments. And underlying all this, and this is something I'll come back to a couple of times, is there's been no clear expression of state goals. And that's something that you see repeatedly in a number of reports over the years. So, and again, I think I'd emphasize that in all these reports, it's not just that CPEC is faulted, it is really the system that is faulted, that our overall, all the players, the way coordination takes place. So as a result of all this, over the last last decade, you've seen a number of proposals to reform or eliminate or change CPEC in some way. And Governor Davis had proposed that in 2002, the elimination of CPEC, which the legislature rejected. Governor Schwarzenegger in 2005 had proposed, picked up on the CPR, the California Performance Review proposal, to merge CPEC along with some other agencies as an executive agency. And again, the legislature rejected that. Members of this body, including, of course, the chair, have proposed legislation to make changes in the way that CPEC is structured or the way its duties are allocated. But until this year, CPEC has remained essentially generally as it originally had been conceived. As you know, the governor had proposed the elimination of CPEC in the revision. It would be effective January 1st of 2012. So he would have permitted CPEC to operate kind of a wind-down period of 6 months in this fiscal year. The legislature rejected that proposal and restored all funding for CPEC, and instead adopted some language for our office to report back on January 1st on options and recommendations for structure and duties of coordination agencies for the state. And then, as you know, the governor vetoed the funding for CPEC. And I think what's interesting about that is the governor originally proposed CPEC would have half a year of funding, and in his veto message took away all funding. And so we got to this place where suddenly July 1 is here and there is no appropriations for CPEC, no general fund appropriations for CPEC. In the governor's veto message, he said, "I am requesting that the state's 3 public higher education segments, along with other higher education stakeholders, explore alternative ways to more effectively improve coordination and development of higher education policy." So I think there was a recognition that there is still some need, but it's really not a very clear mechanism for finding a way to this. And as the executive director of CPEC will testify later this afternoon, all CPEC personnel are scheduled to be laid off within the next 4 months. So the clock is ticking on their 120 days.
Well,
so that's
excuse me, Steve. He vetoed the funding for CPEC effective
for this fiscal year. The money, there is no appropriation in 2011-12 in this fiscal year for CPEC. They have no general fund support.
Okay, but they do have a federal program.
They do have they operate the ITEQ, the Improving Teacher Quality Grant Program, a federal program, which actually funds 2 of their positions.
Okay.
And actually, let me jump into that on our immediate issues.
Right.
So that's how we got to where we are. As this hearing is set up, you have some shorter-term issues, immediate issues that you need to deal with. They're pretty urgent. And then you have longer-term issues that I think are still very, very critical. On the immediate issues, I think the most important one is data. All through these reviews of the master plan over the years, I think the legislature and governor and others have continually expressed the importance of this statewide data clearinghouse on higher education information. It is still not complete as we would like, but it's still about 1.6 billion records of higher education data that's been retrieved that's been provided by the segments. That data ought to go somewhere. Right now it's physically on servers that CPEC maintains. And there needs to be a place for that and somebody to maintain it. There's some institutional memory connected with that data. There is a process in place on how that information gets provided to CPEC. That data has been made available to researchers and others, including our office, in order to be able to monitor and analyze higher education performance. So most critically is what happens to that. And I know there are conversations going on and some further testimony will address that. There are also some legal constraints about FERPA and how the information, who it can be shared with and who can maintain it. So you got legal and practical questions. Second question, as the chair mentioned, is having to do with funding. You still have about 20 staff who will have up to 120 days on the state payroll, and they will also have leave balances to cash out. They have a lease, a 4-year lease on their building. And so when the governor blue penciled this general fund support, there is no provision made for paying these costs. And so these are, again, I think costs the state will be on the hook to pay somehow, and it might be, we have not heard directly from the administration how it intends to ensure these get paid and what fund sources will be used. So there's that kind of short-term funding question. Third question is, the chair mentioned, are these this grant program, the federal grant program, ITQ grants. The governor had originally proposed in his May revision that grant administration be moved to the Department of Education. The legislature again rejected the governor's proposal, so there's been no legislation to move it. But again, I think that had been the administration's proposal. So we still have a responsibility. As of right now, and this is probably another part of your immediate issues, the statute for CPEC has not been modified. The legislature did not approve any trailer bill to eliminate CPEC, and so on the books, CPEC still maintains these functions, although with no funding. And then finally, there are other functions. CPEC, as both Senator Liu and Senator Lowenthal well know, has a number of responsibilities in statute. And with those still on the books, you may want to identify some of those that you think are still critical that need to be carried out immediately. One example might be in new program review. CPEC is responsible for reviewing programs, new programs as the segments develop them. That's what statute requires. If CPEC is not able to do that, do you want to have someone else do that review? Do you want to put some kind of moratorium on development of new programs? I think that's a policy question you want to address fairly quickly. And there are other functions, for example, eligibility reports. When CPEC would look at the eligibility pools of UC and CSU, determine whether their admissions policies in fact are capturing the eligibility pools that the legislature expects. And as you are well aware, UC recently adopted a new eligibility pool, a policy, a pretty significantly different one, and it might be worth, normally CPEC would be doing a review of that and see, okay, how does that play out? So I think in the short term, those are your issues. How do you deal with these functions CPEC was carrying out? How do you pay for the kind of wind down? What do you do with the data, probably most importantly? In the longer term, though, I think we would argue that this isn't just a CPEC issue. This is more fundamentally a higher education coordination and oversight issue. As I indicated, the legislature has asked us to provide a report by January 1, which we will do, and perhaps earlier than that, to give you specific recommendations. But for this hearing, understanding, I think that you wanted to focus more on the short term today, I'll just sketch out those issues for you, and perhaps over the coming months we'd be happy to work with you on them. I think the central question is, what are higher education's goals? And as I indicated earlier, I think any question of oversight, any question of coordination, any question of data and monitoring presumes that we know what it is we want higher education to achieve. And there have been a number of bills, including, of course, the chair had a bill last year. Senator Lowenthal has a bill this year that tries to confront this question of what are higher education's goals. To date, the master plan is very high level in saying higher education should be affordable, there should be access, but it doesn't say what level of enrollment do we want or what level of high school, of college graduations do we want within our population. And so I think as we look at performance, outcomes, it'd be very helpful for the legislature to first, and governor to first be able to work with the segments to establish clear goals for higher education. So I think part of this conversation has to begin with that question. Secondly, how can progress towards these goals be measured, and by whom? This is largely the data question, but it's more than just collecting data. It is understanding what your indicators are for what does success look like. Is that college graduations? Is it time to completion? Is it employment levels? There's a number of different indicators that can be used, and there's no one answer to this. This is something I think that all stakeholders need to come together. And again, I think there have been some efforts the legislature has done in the past that generally have been vetoed by the governor, but it remains, I think, a critical question. Who is going to be monitoring, measuring, and assessing movement towards these goals. And then thirdly, how can the state's policies and budget decisions promote the achievement of these goals? To some extent, you have looked at CPEC to give you recommendations, policy recommendations, on how to improve state performance. Again, it's not entirely CPEC's job. Our office provides some advice and counsel to you on that. The segments themselves certainly work very closely. But generally, is there a space for this conversation about how best to achieve these goals? That is, I think, the center of this coordination expectation that we have. So none of these issues is really new, but I think the elimination of CPEC exposes them more starkly and really gives you the impetus to say, rather than what do we do with CPEC or what do we do with the specific statutory responsibilities that are currently in statute, to stand back a little bit and say, how do we coordinate higher education? How do we set goals and measure? And towards that purpose, we are happy to work with you in the coming weeks and months, and I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you very much. I wanted to welcome Senator Lowenthal. Thank you for joining us. Thank you. Do you have any questions?
Just listening.
Just listening. Okay. Mr. Boyer, you have started your committee to look at this question of where higher education.
Yeah, the supplemental report language asks that we develop specific recommendations to the legislature. And actually I have the language here. It's requiring that we submit a report that includes recommendations with respect to the structure and duties of statewide higher education coordinating body in California, and it asks that we consult with stakeholders. We've begun those consultations. We have met with all the segments. We have met with CPEC staff. We have met with legislative staff. We are still looking to talk with the administration and other student groups and others. But yes, we've begun those conversations, and I think I'm sincere when I say that we've put out some general recommendations to you in the past. I think that this really, the question has become much larger, and we really don't, at this point, know what specifically we would recommend to you. There's a lot of trade-offs, and I think the biggest trade-off is between the idea of independence, a state-level independent voice that's able to express, identify, and promote states' interests, and balancing that against autonomy to the segments, because I think that's another important principle, that there are decisions that really are properly made at a segmental level and not a state level. And where that line is really largely a policy call, but I think that's where a lot of these things are hung up before. Some of the previous governors have said they want more of, I think the word they've used is more of a hammer to come down on the segments when goals aren't achieved. I think what the segments have expressed has been that the achievement of goals is not strictly the responsibility of the segments, that the state provides resources and provides policies and statutes. So really there's, I think, a need to have a philosophical conversation about where that line is drawn between state responsibilities and segmental responsibilities. And that's where we're trying to focus a lot of our effort right now. The other thing I'd mention is that we are directed by statute to look at what other states are doing as models. And I know that we have a representative from NCHEMS here today that will also be able to provide us with some background from other states.
Great. Thank you. Okay,
Thank you.
Thanks. I'm sure this is the beginning of a conversation. Thank you. I think next on the agenda is Karen Humphrey from CPAC. Good afternoon, Karen.
Good afternoon, Chair Lou and Senator Lowenthal. Before I begin, I'd just like to acknowledge that along with myself, a member of the staff from CPEC are here. I just really want to acknowledge the work of the CPEC staff and the commissioners over many years. And I also brought them along for a very practical reason in case you have specific questions that they would best answer. But it's I'm pleased to have them here. I'll probably repeat some of what the LAO said because I think first they understand CPEC very well, and we clearly agree with them on many of the issues that they've identified. And we had looked forward to the discussion and the study of the coming months. We appreciate your invitation to appear at this hearing. And as a starting point, we're providing you with a list of CPEC's statutory functions and requirements and a fact sheet that helps address your questions on the data resources. And we can always provide additional materials as you need them. As you know, CPEC is very good at generating reports and papers and statistics, so just ask. As to our timeline, our staff members now have about 115 days in which to find new positions under the state's SROA and layoff process. And we expect to close in mid to late November, somewhere possibly before Thanksgiving. We're concerned about the functions of CPEC and the data and research resources that have been developed over the 51 years that we and our predecessor council have been in operation. We're inventorying what we have, we're consulting with stakeholders, and we're seeking at least short-term solutions in the remaining weeks that CPEC is in operation. Within a few weeks, I expect to have much better answers to these questions. As we talk about both near-term and long-term responses to the elimination of CPEC, I reiterate what I've said before about the long-term, in which I think echoes the LAO. The legislature, the governor, the segments, and the people of California need to really think about and consider what it is that we need, want, and are willing to pay for in providing higher education opportunities to Californians. If we're not clear on what we're looking for from the complex system of higher ed in California, how can we best know how to coordinate it? The master plan's strong vision of accessible, affordable higher education of outstanding quality in California has been really a world leader. The master plan recognized that higher education was already very complex with the 3 public systems and many private institutions. The coordination function was partly intended to solve practical problems, like how the state should decide who builds new campuses, offers specific kinds of post-secondary credentials, and figures out how well the public needs are being met. The master plan also expected the coordination function would facilitate looking at the big picture and planning for California's future higher education needs. And as noted by the LAO, it does not address outcomes, what the system in total should be expected to produce, and how we can hold ourselves and all of the systems accountable for those outcomes. So I second the call, and I've said this before in committee hearings, the call to really seriously address the need to set state goals. The master plan identified a need for information that's independent, based on solid data and analysis, and unbiased by the individual needs of any separate part of higher education in California. Those needs are quite legitimate. They're based on the missions and the populations that are served and the expectations of the people of California, but it is really up to state policymakers to assure those needs are balanced with the needs of the state, and the Independent Coordinating Board has been identified as the mechanism to provide that balance. There may be others. The hearing today addresses a few specific questions: what happens to the aggregate and longitudinal data on CPEC's servers and website, what to do about the program and facility review functions designed to promote the best use of scarce state resources, and how to be sure that admission requirements in the UC and CSU line up with the eligibility standards in the master plan. As the LAO said, the CPEC asset most at risk is 1.6 billion records in the most extensive database on post-secondary education in California. That database also includes at least 10 years' worth of linked student identifier data from the 3 public segments, 120 million records, that enable us to track cohorts of students and analyze their enrollment, completions, transfers, and other indicators that help us understand how public higher education is doing. And almost all but the student identifier data is not available on the internet, of course, but all of our aggregate data is not only available on the internet, but it is you can download data, you can customize reports, and this is really the student identifier longitudinal data is the core data for what should eventually be a system that links students from preschool through all levels of post-secondary education and into the workforce. A comprehensive, integrated, longitudinal database that is not an end into itself, but an essential tool for knowing how the state is doing and preparing its students for learning, work, and life. For the past year, CPEC has been deeply involved in collaborative talks with the public segments, the K-12 system, and the Employment Development Department to find a way to bring this system together with existing resources. We've been working toward a joint powers authority that would share governance of such a system and help ensure that it fully involves the producers of data and other stakeholders to best serve the public interest. It may be difficult in the short term to preserve CPEC's student identifier data. This data is covered by very stringent federal and state privacy laws and cannot just be passed on to another entity without carefully analyzing the legal requirements. CPEC has not only compiled this data, it has learned many lessons about linking data and how to improve the matching of records. So we are committed to finding at least a short-term solution to preserving it while the JPA and other initiatives are pursued by the other data partners and the legislation. We're looking into the legal issues and also working with those segments. CPEC also compiles, connects, and reports the many forms of aggregate data of post-secondary education on our website, not just in California, but a lot of that data reaches beyond the state's boundaries. So the most concern we have heard is over access to this data by policymakers, research entities, journalists, and the general public. We also hope to find a home for these resources, although I can't yet identify it. Moving to program and facilities reviews, over the past 2 decades, CPEC has developed criteria for these reviews that are widely accepted by the segments. These criteria are, to a large extent, used by the segments in their own internal reviews, but you need a neutral external entity to evaluate if the internal decisions to create new and potentially costly programs or construct new campuses or educational centers are consistent with statewide needs and are a good use of public resources. CPEC was actually beginning to consider a more global review and periodic update on program trends to see if the segments as a whole are making decisions that were responsive to the state needs more in the aggregate. This is a good time to look at that potential change of approach, as both program and facilities expansion have been slowed to some degree, but not totally stopped by the recession and budget pressures. The 2 functions were given to CPEC with very little actual authority, but having these checks was considered very important under the master plan. We have no suggestions at this point for what might be done with the functions, but even with the current slowdown, we anticipate some large programs will be proposed within the next year. So it will be important to start looking at what an option might be for addressing this need in the absence of CPEC. On the matter of eligibility studies, their purpose, as you've heard, is to ascertain that CSU and UC admission standards are consistent with the percentages of California high school graduates specified in the master plan, 12.5% for the UC, 33.33% for the CSU. These are normally conducted every 3 to 5 years, and the last one was in 2007. The segments do the bulk of the work, that's transcript review, but some independent entity is needed to design the questions the study should answer and independently check the findings. We need to do another eligibility study within the next year or 2. Again, I have no specific recommendation for who would do that. I would note on the federal program, we have already been in discussions with the California Department of Education because they administer the K-12 portion of this title. It comes out of NCLB. They are very both willing to work with us on that. So it is a matter of considerable importance to us that higher ed continue to be a collaborative partner in teacher professional development, and this program also really makes us a collaborative partner in teacher preparation and builds that linkage and collaboration across the sectors. So we're definitely working to make sure that will remain intact. As you may hear from others, the most successful coordinating boards in the country are those in states where the governor and the legislature make a significant priority on a consistent basis for higher education, where they use the resources of the board to inform and help drive good policy, and where the hard questions about how to improve higher education can be considered. In spite of the huge erosion of state resources for public higher education over the past decade, higher education has not risen to the priority it really should have as a policy issue. I believe that we need to elevate it, but not in its own silo. We must start thinking of and dealing with education as a continuum from early childhood to adulthood, that learning should never stop throughout one's life, and that the state's education infrastructure should be continuously building and changing as needed to ensure the future of Californians. CPEC will not be there to engage in that dialogue, but we certainly hope the work we've done over the past decades will continue to inform it. And we pledge that as long as we're actually in operation, we are more than willing to support the dialogue and be in conversation with you. So thank you very much.
Thank you
if you
very
have any
much.
questions, I'm happy to answer them.
Have any questions? Okay, we're going to we'll have an opportunity to have this conversation continue for at least a couple more months.
Thank
So,
you. Yes,
yeah.
we're happy to be there.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. The next is Lori Nazura from CSAC. And how does these data issues affect what you are doing over in Student Aid Commission?
Well, thank you very much, Chair Liu and Senator Lowenthal, for the opportunity to be here and talk to you about how these data functions will affect the operations over at the Student Aid Commission, and why it's important to the state that the collection of this data remain available. By way of background, the Student Aid Commission is also a data repository for the state of California. We receive the FAFSA data of every California student and every out-of-state student who applies to a California post-secondary institution, over 2.7 million records. We receive over 4 million student GPAs from over 2,600 high schools and colleges. We receive loan balance data and use the National Student Loan Database System when processing our loan forgiveness. And we're now currently preparing to collect enrollment, persistence, and graduation data from all Cal Grant participating institutions, as well as wage and placement data from institutions with programs that lead to gainful employment. So regarding our use of CPEC data, CPEC collects college-going counts from the California Department of Education and reports this data on a regional basis. The Student Aid Commission uses this data as a benchmark to determine the effectiveness of our California Student Opportunity and Access Program, also known as CalSOAP. We have 15 CalSOAP projects and our statewide Cash for College program, both funded through the College Access Challenge Grant, the federal initiative on ensuring access for low-income students. CalSOAP provides services to middle and high school students to increase student achievement and foster post-secondary and financial aid awareness. Our Cash for College provides FAFSA completion services for over 35,000 students and parents annually, and offers national research organizations a platform to conduct student-level research to inform national educational policy. So what we do is we annually compare the CalSOAP's college-going rates with the regional rates reported by CPEC to ensure that the CalSOAP services are producing gains above that of the normal population. The college-going counts are also used as criterion for awarding our competitive Cal Grant awards, and also as criterion for determining the top 2% of Cal Grant Entitlement B awards, and those entitle the students to both tuition and fees and a $1,551 access grant in their first year, whereas all the other 98% of our Cal Grant B students get the access grant only in their first year, and then tuition and fees and access the following 3 years. The Student Aid Commission continues to develop and expand higher education and financial aid relationships that are of great benefit to students and to the state. Through our operating agreement with the Educational Credit Management Corporation, also known as ECMC, and working closely with the U.S. Department of Education, CSAC has been able to secure over $160 million in general fund offset for Cal Grants over the last 2 years. Additionally, ECMC and the Commission are planning a joint research project in 2012. We currently have information sharing relationships with the U.S. Department of Education, the California Department of Education, the Department of Social Services, National Guard, CalEMA, high schools, and each of the post-secondary education segments, as well as private organizations such as College Access Foundation, MDRC, and the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. So in summary, the Student Aid Commission currently relies on CPEC's college-going counts. Without this data, we may need to change our scoring process for competitive and top 2% awards. Secondly, we will be gathering enrollment, persistence, completion, wage, and placement data from all Cal Grant participating institutions, which will be useful to the state in the potential absence of similar data from CPEC. And finally, with our current relationships and extra resources, we are capable of assuming additional data and research responsibilities.
You have extra resources?
No. I said with extra
If you have.
That was a polite
Yes.
way of saying
Yes.
These savings, why not give us the money?
Right. Yes.
Well, if you choose to park your information somewhere else, we have a platform already developed. We have capacity. We would need resources. That's the polite, what I was politely trying to say.
You have access to the student identifier that Ms. Humphrey was referring to?
Well, normally the student identifier that we deal with is the Social Security number,
Okay,
and
so you don't. Oh,
we don't
okay.
use the
right.
the statewide student identifier.
Okay. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Okay. Our next speaker is Ames McGinnis. He's a senior associate with the National Center of Higher Education Management Systems, which is a private nonprofit policy center out of Boulder, Colorado. And he specializes in state governance and coordination of higher education, strategic planning, and restructuring higher education systems, the roles and responsibilities of public, institutional, and multi-campus systems, governing boards, and international comparisons of education reform. You've made this quite a yes.
I need editing to make it shorter.
You have. You have done work here before in many other states in California, and we welcome you this afternoon because we are in this transition. Mm-hmm. So we're looking for some answers, right?
Right.
Well, we'll see what you have to offer.
Okay, thank you. I had prepared a PowerPoint, but I'm not going to do it.
You're not going to do it?
Because I think it's going to be much better to
just speak.
Yeah, I think it's just going to be much better, and I can explain exactly. PowerPoints get deadly if you look at them.
And yours was 38
so you have
slides,
information
too, right?
in the PowerPoints which you can use.
That's
Yes.
Right. We can all, at our leisure.
Yeah, at a leisure, right, exactly.
This is not the time. You need to talk to us about what's going on out there.
Okay,
Now,
all right.
this is...
It's a direction.
I always say this just whenever I go to a state. I probably know a fair amount about California, but just enough to get into real trouble. So what I'm going to talk with you about is not...
Mr. Jones has been here a couple of times, too.
Pardon me?
Mr. Jones has been
here. Oh,
here.
yeah, Dennis, my colleague. But
yes.
I had the honor of working really closely with Clark Kerr for a number of years, and particularly on governance issues. So but also I write about and I've followed sort of the history of coordination in the U.S. for about 35 years. So I've known a lot about what goes on in California, but I want to talk about what's really going on around the country. And I think the number one, you have an extraordinary opportunity in what is happening right now, particularly with CPEC. Dennis Jones and I, if the truth were known, have been behind the wiping out and reconstituting of coordination in a number of states around the country. Basically because entities created at the time that the master plan was developed in the 60s were really a set of functions which are no longer necessarily relevant. Mm-hmm. But you have an accumulation of not only those functions, but an accumulation, usually in coordinating board states, of endless legislative mandates. So you have a set of entities sitting there struggling with inadequate staff, no recognition of what they're doing, trying to do things which in fact may nowhere be connected with anything. And but the bottom line is that it's extremely important to have the kind of an entity in California which is really focused on exactly what the LAO report was saying. What is the future of California? Mm-hmm. And how does this whole system connect with getting into those goals? Now, really a fundamental change in the history that Steve outlined is that coordination really started out as coordination of higher education with itself. The real issue today is the connection of higher education with the future of the state. That's a fundamentally different issue. If you have coordinating boards that are really focused on trying to get things to work together on a mechanic, they are totally in the face of in the state, the segments and the institutions, and they tend to mess around with a set of issues which are getting all the issues of the difference between really policy leadership and coordination and governance. You have two major entities in this state responsible for governing those university sectors. They ought to be held accountable for governing those sectors. To the extent that they are not governing those sectors, they ought to be really held accountable by you for not doing that. But those are governance issues. The same thing with the community colleges. One of the weaknesses you've got, which a lot of other states have, is that you have an extreme fragmentation and governance of community colleges and no capacity to bring them together in any way. And that's an Achilles heel of this state and many others. And I'm not talking about centralized governance, but the problem is that there's no way to get coherence with that set of things. The states that have community college systems that are well coordinated, and I'd take two examples in terms of Washington State and Virginia, what you can have is some consistency across the state about what's happening in a decentralized system. But anyway, the issues have really merged, really grown from sort of coordination among, preventing duplication among, trying to wrestle these large animals, to the ground, to saying, look, when you add it up, we have a lot of higher education capacity in this state, and it ought to include you. I mean, the major providers in many states, I'm thinking of Illinois right now, happen to be the for-profit sector. They are not the public sector. If you focus only on coordinating the public sector, you really ignore the role that the independent sector and a whole set of other people who are in the business and frankly not doing it very well, but they are the major players.
That's pretty frightening.
It's really the connection of all that to the future of the state.
Right.
Now, if you look at coordination across the country, what's happened is that states have had a very difficult time making that transition, and there are a whole set of reasons for that. These entities were created at a time when you had legislators who were in positions such as yours who were the authors of the legislation. You had governors who remembered what it was all about. And they constantly worked on the issues that Steve outlined. You need an entity that works with the legislature and with the governor and with higher education, but also is seen as a major broker interconnection with all the other leadership entities in the state. Just parenthetically, you ought to rethink the charge even to the LAO. The constituents here are not the segments.
Right.
The constituents are the citizens of California.
Right.
I mean, it's really the business and civic leadership of the state you ought to listen to, and then you ought to consult the segments about what that all means, but they shouldn't be the ones. You don't go to them. There's no evidence anywhere in the world of simply going to higher ed and saying, how do you coordinate and create an entity that will come up with the answer you want? I'm working in Greece right now on what to do with the future of Greece. The last thing you do is look with the rectors' councils and groups to figure out what they're doing. I mean, they are against everything about the future of Greece. Okay? But
so we don't have any best practices anywhere?
What?
We don't have any best practices anywhere?
Well, anyway, so now what's happened in places, there's another thing I've learned about California over the years, which has good California has not necessarily enamored of looking at other places as examples, but I'm going to give you some that I think have really made a difference. The state that I think, there are 2 or 3 states that have really made a difference in changing the role of their coordinating boards. Dennis and I played a role in total wiping out the coordinating board in Kentucky and creating the Council on Post-Secondary Education. And the charge to that entity, just contrast that with CPEC, is to shape, build consensus around, and really shape the long-term goals for that state. And then to develop the indicators related to that, to monitor the accountability, and then to assure the alignment of finance policy, not only appropriations, but tuition policy and student aid for getting you there. And to be the principal entity to which the governor and the legislature look for really keeping this state on track on that agenda. And the other thing that they do, and they're doing it very well right now, is that they need to identify the 3 or 4 things that absolutely need to be solved to move the state ahead. They're the ones who really shaped the issues that turned into legislation on what's now Senate Bill 1 to implement Common Core and new assessments and everything across K-12. They were the ones who really shaped the legislation on transfer and articulation. And there are a whole set of other things. But the role of that entity is not to is to basically shape the issues, make a compelling argument, build the understanding around them so that the government and the legislature have essentially the groundwork done for them to be able to really deal with a major policy issue.
Who sits on that council? Are they just other
You would
appointees?
not have, under any circumstances, segments sitting on that. Now, having said that, there's nothing that entity can do without extensive involvement
with the segments.
of the higher education community.
Right.
In fact, if the staff has no capability to build credibility and support and engagement of those people, the game is totally lost. Mm-hmm. But that means, but the agenda is not coordination of those people in the sense of constantly being in their face.
Right.
If for just as one example, if you have a proposal that goes all the way through the governing structure of either one of the major, either CSU or UC, that creates a new school and a new program that is not needed by California, the people there ought to be held accountable. It should not be put on a CPEC to suddenly second guess that. That's a total failure of the governance of those two systems. And they ought to be drawn up here, and they'd said, how in heaven's name did it ever get to the point that you would have had such a decision made within your governing structure? What happens in states is that institutions delegate upwards decisions which they're unable to make within their own systems, and that's where you really get a failure of governance. But those decisions need to be made to the maximum extent possible within the segments, within the framework, with the clarity about where the state's going and the fact that you don't have any money. I mean, doing anything new without a whole different way of financing it and thinking about it should be totally unacceptable these days. So anyway, that's the kind of entity that one needs. Now, the other place that has done this really well but has endless problems is Texas. Texas, through the leadership of the coordinating board, developed a thing called Closing the Gaps, which has been very good in keeping the state focused on where it ought to go. And to give you an example about what I mean by state, in discussion with the Senate Education Committee in Texas last year about the same issue, there were only 2 or 3 members of that this was the joint House-Senate committee, who I knew did not have a clue what Closing the Gaps was about. There were a couple that you look at and they're kind of, anyway, that's Texas, but most of those members of the House and Senate knew what the Closing Gaps was about, and they had a clear sense of when something was off track and on track. To give just one example, they had a bill which they passed to create 7 new research universities. And the legislators were sitting around and dividing up and which one of their institutions was going to get a chance to creep up the thing. But the chair of the committee, Senator Zaffirini, said, now, she asked me of this rhetorically, said, now, does this creation of these institutions bear any relationship to our long-term goal of meeting the goals of closing the gaps? She was answering her own question. And so when you really, that is really what ought to happen in states. And Dennis Jones and I and several other people, I'm not alone on this, have really almost spent our lives saying that's what ought to happen. Now, this is what's happening in USA right now. You have a set of actions by governors and legislators that totally ignore any of the above. They're basically wiping out agencies for budget reasons. They're listening to one of the major university presidents who was mad at the coordinating board anyway, just saying, oh, well, that he didn't like it, so let's just wipe it out, and we're cutting out budget things. It's an agenda of essentially cut, slash, and do nothing, without really saying what is the longer-term perspective. And part of the reality of this is that creating an agency these days in any state is really hard. And what I think is, this is something both Dennis and I have written out, and several other people. I think if you think of the fact that you need an entity to essentially play the roles of goal setting, objective analysis, independence, indicators, that's putting on the agenda the strategic links on finance policy, shaping the 5 or 6 major issues that must be resolved by California, making sure you're shaping the policies in a way that you can act on them and the governor can pursue them. But they need to do that in total linked at the hip with the other large other essentially nonprofit groups, NGO groups, whether it's the Public Policy Institute or the group, at Sac State, or the thing that, what is it, California, whatever it is, Competitive Challenge. Because doing this only through state government is going to be impossible virtually in any state.
Right.
But it can be the focal point for the work that they also do in partnership with it. We've even talked about creating entities which are by definition and legally public-private, because it's going to be very hard to pay competitive salaries to top analysts and leading within the structure of many states' civil service positions. But you shouldn't shy away from that kind of thing. So maybe the best way to say this is that in any country I'm working, or in any state, the future of the state really depends upon having an entity that is really clearly focused on that is independent, that is seen by both the governor and the legislature and the sectors as leading a long-term agenda with continuity. These things are not going to be accomplished in the short term. And you need to think of it in a way in which you don't have any new money, you can't build new bureaucracies, but to do it in a way that you're doing in a public-private kind of partnership way. And anyway, that's it's the difference between the reality, what's happening there in the U.S., and I think what really needs to happen in states. There are a few good examples, but there are not very many. Maybe to stop there.
You mentioned Kentucky as one of the examples. Can you give us some other examples of that somewhat either the same or somewhat different, or how they evolve?
Yeah, let me just use Texas as an example, because
you mentioned Texas.
Most of these entities were created just about the same time as the as the master plan. They were really, 60s, 70s. Same thing with Texas, and the coordinating board had functions that were much deeper than CPEC. CPEC is about as toothless a tiger in coordination as they could possibly have developed. Rather than developing a strategic plan, instead of advising the development, it's really fuzzy. The coordinating board in Texas.
In California, we create all these boards and tell them, but you can't do anything.
Right.
Participation leading nowhere.
This might be true. The agency has a clear charge to develop a strategic master plan, to develop a budget formula, to do program review and approval, and administers a set of functions. But it has a very strong role, much stronger role than CPEC in the budget process. But on the other hand, it has had historically very little emphasis on policy.
Right.
And frankly, the legislators are really frustrated that it was playing no leadership in getting connective finance policy with any kind of an agenda. So I think it's been the process of developing Closing the Gaps, which was developed in 1998, a year after the Kentucky thing. It's been sustained through that. And the governor, the political leadership, governor, lieutenant governor, have sort of been in and out of this, but the core legislative leadership and the business community have been very good about developing, I think, workable ways of linking funding to that agenda. So that some of the things I know that you worked on, I think they're making progress. You know, it's, as you know, it's not exactly it's an uphill battle. I mean,
it's really an uphill battle.
But they're at least doing something like that. Now, if I go beyond those two states, I noticed that the LAO mentioned Illinois. We worked a lot with Illinois. Unfortunately, Illinois is, the coordinating board there is on the edge of, it's slightly working on the fumes, let's put it that way. But it did something that was very good. It really did try to develop a public agenda with the legislative leadership deeply involved. They had a few governor problems. And I think that in the next generation, I mean, they, with a new governor and the legislative leadership still engaged, they will then reemerge as being really an effective agency.
So, some of these coordinating boards you've talked about are not, the Texas one has politicians on it, correct?
Well, it's a dramatic contrast for what you have. You have really significant leaders. No, it's not politicians. These are really...
Higher education leaders?
No. They're all...
Business folks?
Major...
Nonprofits?
Yes. That's the kind of leadership you need on this. You don't... This is not about coordinating how you mess with internal coordination.
Sounds like it's not looking in, it's looking out.
It's looking, right, looking to the future.
Yeah, looking to the link.
And now, again, I shouldn't say that you want to corral a group of business leaders to go tell higher ed what to do, okay? That's not generally the function of these entities.
Right.
There are accountability issues that are involved, but it's really getting engaged with the people who are concerned about the future of the state involved in this. Now, the Texas members of the coordinating board at times get deep into minutia, but that's, I mean, I've served for 16 years on a board. That will happen at times. But if you have a statute that's clear about what it's about, clear mandate to develop the kind of goals that we talked about earlier that Steve mentioned, and, you know, we'd be pleased to work with you to try to get that kind of statute. And I think if you have that in place, then these other entities will have a focal point in government that's credible and independent that you can work with. And if you make use of it and others do, I think that it could make a great deal of difference for the future of the state. So...
Well, it is a challenge. You know, I mean, it's a challenge for all of us, and it's for in a term-limited environment, it's an exceptional challenge, and it's a...
That's the real Achilles heel all over the country. I mean, there isn't any...
stick-to-itiveness here.
In the Texas situation, you've got the legislative leadership in both the House and Senate are outstanding. I mean, they have a sort of sense of history of the complexity of that, and that, I mean, you all get that, but
it's sporadic. It's,
I mean, we I'm sure in Kentucky and in Texas, you mentioned one of the goals is that this really provides what the legislature and the governor need. They help to really lay out this vision or these goals, and they work together in terms of policy and financial with the legislature. Well, our legislature turns over so fast that we don't even know what we want, and so we don't really ask a whole lot of anybody, and we have very poor connectivity between what that does, and we rely more on our own staff and their linkages rather than to really delegate and say we really need to have a body out there that not just, you know, works, as you point out, between the institutions and it, but really looks at where the future, where we're going, what are the goals, what do we want to do. We're not around long enough. People
and incidentally, part of the...
I will tell you. By the time you finally realize you need that information, you're gone.
The other piece I'd much say that I spent a lot of my life with OECD on working with countries, and it is really important to have the goals also relate to the future research competitiveness of the state. That the agenda is, there's a lot of emphasis, as it should be, given the demographics of this state. You've got to educate the population.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
But
what
kind
drove
of
the
higher
state
ed
is the research, and is what we all know that's what has driven this great economy.
But also the assumption that it's driving the economy may be also not right all of the time. But so having that on the agenda, that the it is somewhat frightening to sit with. I worked in India over the last few years with the World Bank with the Knowledge Commission and the discussions that go from the breadth of needing to educate the population as well as develop research capacity, which is in fact linked to the future of the country. So that's the kind of an agenda. Now, that in itself becomes, and I hate to use the word, an advocacy of why higher ed is so important to the future of this state. And in that way, it's different from coordination in the past, which was all about preventing bad things from happening.
Correct, right.
It's, this is for something that somebody ought to be around. And that, I guess the final point I just make is the really scary thing. If you look at across the world, the countries that are making progress, it's ones that even though you've had change in political leadership, there's been consistency in goals, and even though the tactics may have changed, there's a constant working around towards progress to the same things. So what you've done is essentially gotten yourself stuck in a 1960s set of goals and not really reshaped those. So I totally underscore what Steve said. Clarity about a new vision about where the state is going with an entity charged with really keeping focused on that would really make a difference.
Really difficult.
Well, anyway.
Have a clue where we're going.
No, I think we do have a clue about where we're going, economically and socially. I'm not sure about politically, but that always is kind of the, wag the tail
That's
here.
the problem when you're really about 7 states all mixed together as one.
That's right. Right. And some people are trying to separate us, kind of thing. But it's really provocative. I mean, I think that, when I started here in the assembly in 2000, I was appalled by how come we don't have a stated vision about where we're going. It's all about the politics of the time and what's convenient. And, when I came here, we had an $8 billion surplus. Well, I mean, then we had an energy crisis, and then we had the dot-com crash, and then we had this recession. It's been downhill economically ever since, and we see a little light at the end of the tunnel, except unemployment is still high. And yet you hear about the Apples of the world. Silicon Valley is hiring folks, et cetera, at a very high level. Mm-hmm. And yet there are very low-level jobs that the people in the middle are getting squeezed. And then you hear about the demographics and about, the African Americans and the Latinos are suffering greatly from this whole 10-year period. And how does that all compute about what is going on, and how do we come to a far-out vision about where we need to go?
Right.
And that's kind of, for me, it's like it's a rough road because I don't think there is a lot of political consensus about what the proper steps are. And yet we do know that CPEC is gone, but we do know there's a need to have something. And I agree with you. I don't think the coordinate. I mean, when you were talking about, I guess, or Steve was talking about need. I mean, we have University Irvine who created another law school that California didn't need, and we have a struggling UC Riverside that really needs a medical school that's not being funded. Kind of thing. So, how does this all happen? And I agree that CPEC didn't have any kind of weight in the game. Come to the table and tell you and advocate about California's needs. There isn't anybody who does that, except that for us individual legislators who do it for our own districts, so to speak. But for someone to have a bigger vision, the governor, who seems to be very mirrored in his budget crisis, so it's cut, conversation. It's really, but as my office has always talked about, well, in times of crisis, it's time to sit down and start creating and thinking positively about how we can get out of it and plan for the future. We can't do anything about it now, but at least we can take steps to
part of the
laying
just
out
listening
something.
to you though, this setting goals and data systems and everything fine. The truth is that this has to have some quasi-regulatory feature to it. It really matters that you have some discussion about providing access and opportunity across the diversity of your institutions, and not to delegate that to each of the institutions as they try to set their own tuition and admissions policies.
Right.
But it isn't just public sector. Who is going to accommodate the large numbers of people across the diversity you talked about, and what is the role and the quality of what's being done in each of those other providers? And maybe you need to think of a whole different way of providing services to those populations. On program review, not reviewing everything, but it ought to be reviewing or setting a framework for where there needs to be high-cost graduate and professional programs to meet the various needs of the state, and where there are needs and not. And therefore, when decision-making goes through the extensive process within the segments, it ought to take into consideration that framework. And if it does not, it ought to go right back to them. So that I wouldn't say, just wipe out all things that are traditional functions, but unfortunately,
Right.
and I won't comment about this state, a lot of the coordinating boards have staff capacity reviewing everything that moves and leading to reports that lead to nothing. So you've got to really focus on a few areas that really are strategically important for the state. That's, well, anyway, if we can be helpful to you in any way of shaping something that is an alternative. I think just, as I think Steve and others said, this ought to be an opportunity for new thinking.
Right.
That would be great.
Okay.
Okay.
We need to involve the administration in this conversation.
That does matter.
It does matter. Okay. Thank
So-
you very much.
Okay, thank you.
And then if we have any questions on your 30-slide presentation, we'll be sure to contact you.
Yeah, or I can develop you another 30 when I couldn't PowerPoint you to death. Okay.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Any other comments, Senator Lowenthal?
No, now that we have a direction, let's hear how the...
Now we have the comments. Okay, let's have the segments come up. We have the community colleges in the CSU's, University of California, and the independents. We did not invite the for-profits, huh? Oh, did we? But they didn't come. Okay, that's good. Okay, why don't we, well, I don't,
Madam Chairman?
okay, we'll start with CSU's then.
We actually, I was asked,
We work together here.
Oh, did you? Okay.
Amazingly
I was
enough.
asked on behalf of my colleagues to actually make a general presentation on the issues as we saw them, and then we're all willing to obviously have a dialogue with you. But
Okay.
our thought was you'd probably want to hear it once rather than 4 times, and that might be serve a better use of your time.
Sure, thank you.
So first, let me start by thanking you and Senator Lowenthal and your staff for putting this together. We appreciate the severity and the seriousness, both of the short term and the long term, as it relates to not only CPEC, but the future of higher education in California. I've been asked to provide the collective view, and I'm going to try to go through that, and then each of the experts here at the table are happy to augment that and answer questions. But before speaking to the agenda directly, we all want to say publicly and on behalf of all of our segments how much we've appreciated working with the people at CPEC over the last many years. And that we all sit here, as we've indicated to Karen and the rest of her team, to help in any way we can in a respectful transition for all of them. And we wish them all well. And we've all had our times, but we've really appreciated their work and their support. And our hearts are with them and their families as it relates to the transitions that I know that if all of us faced them, I'd be scared to death. So I'll just say that out loud. All of us, the AICCU, the University of California, community colleges, and CSU, agree that there are some immediate issues that we need to deal with. But we also think that we all need to take a breath, which we appreciate you're trying to do here today, about where we go from here in determining what California needs today and how we can work together to achieve that as a collective on behalf of the state. It's scary how common our themes are going to be with your presenters prior to now. So let's start, first of all, we concur strongly that before we do anything, it's really critical that we have a clear, articulated public agenda for higher education. All of us have been working with both of you and others for a decade as it relates to trying to outline that vision so that it can guide all of our work, whether it's here in the Capitol or at a campus level as it relates to what we're trying to achieve for the state. A state needs to set those goals and objectives so that we are focused not only for the state but for our students. And I think it's consistent with some of the concerns that I've heard expressed here already. Certainly term limits has created a challenge as it relates to long-term thinking. And I was at lunch earlier today and somebody asked me what my undergraduate degree was in, and it was urban and regional planning, which taught me that you have to think 5, 10, 20, 30 years past in making decisions because their impact will be that long. And of course, that's not the way the building operates these days, which is unfortunate, not by lack of trying by you and others. I think that we believe, and I'm going a little off the mark here, that setting those goals and objectives are probably important to do statutorily in order to have them in place. And in fact, I'll speak for CSU. When we started working with Dee Dee Alpert on this issue, it was exactly for that reason. It was in anticipation of the types of changes that were going to come about with term limits and needing to put some kind of outline about what our goals and objectives were as a state in order to have it continuously there, regardless of what a CPEC was or would be as it relates to monitoring that. We really needed to be explicit so that they lasted from year to year, from term to term, whether a governor or a legislature. These we consider our statewide goals that still respect the individual roles of the segments and, frankly, the institutions. And there's a very fine line which you've already talked about. We believe that setting expectations and holding us all accountable is important. That's not just the systems. That is policymakers. That is the governor. That is the faculty, the students, the staff, and the other parts of our institutions, but also the public. So accountability to those is very important, but we also believe, as we've worked on this issue, that it really is a function for all of us, and that a new entity, let's say CPEC 2.0, has a role in helping us focus on how we're going to achieve the outcomes that we've set forward as our goals and objectives, and that we stay focused on what those are, providing that best possible educational opportunity with, frankly, the resources we have available, because we just need to be pragmatic and realistic about what we can or cannot do in the environment that we're all working in. So we think your first step really needs to be, how are we going to set about defining these goals and objectives? And we'd urge you to continue to work with us on legislation to do that, because we think that's probably a pretty solid way to keep us focused. We also think that we need to recognize that the value of that process is focus. And I don't mean to be disrespectful to you or CPEC, but if you looked at the statutes regarding CPEC, it is one of the greatest mismatches of statutory direction almost as convoluted, with all due respect, Patrick, to the codes for the community colleges. We really need to have a focus here as it relates to what you want this entity to do and how they can play a role in keeping us focused on those statewide agenda. The second issue that we wanted to raise today is, we've talked a bit about already, is the title of the hearing is about higher education coordination, and frankly, we do think that's the important role of the new CPEC 2.0. A coordinating body that helps facilitate the success of those goals and objectives and holds us all accountable to those outcomes. What we need is an entity that has the leadership capacity. Leadership which is earned, not granted, and that has the policy and analytical expertise to deal with very complex issues, which might suggest that isn't a stagnant staff. It might suggest that there are models of tapping into expertise in areas to do this kind of research versus assuming that your core staff have the capability and capacity on every complex issue that's facing the segments and the state. Coordination is critical if we're going to ensure that students are prepared for college, can complete their degree in a timely manner, that we are preparing the workforce for today and tomorrow, and that we are leveraging the power of the whole. The coordination should not just be with higher ed. As a result, we believe it should also be with the integration and coordination with K-12, and certainly K-12 has been a part of CPEC, but we all felt very strongly that we are so integrated and connected, and what K-12 provides and how we help K-12 also results in what we all can deliver when students do come our way. There are some immediate issues that you've talked about already. First of all, the Teacher Quality Improvement Program, and of course, the database. I think that we have a general sense that there are approaches in the immediate short term on how to shift the responsibility of the administration of the Teacher Quality Improvement Grants. There's certainly been some initial conversations, as Karen indicated, with the department. We believe that or a model that works collaboratively with all of us, since we're all part of that grant process, is probably a good idea, but certainly we don't want to risk $8 million or so that's trying to support innovation in teacher education. We also agree, probably more strongly than you do, that we need to protect the database. And that database and that work that Gus Chavez and others at CPEC have done over all of these decades is very important. It's helpful for us in doing our work. It's helpful for you as policymakers. And we want to make sure that it remains intact and available to all of us. But we also need to be very clear that that data is FERPA-based data. And from a segment point of view, we have a legal obligation to make sure that that data is in an educational research entity and that it is protected under the federal obligations that we have in having shared that data with CPEC. Our institutional experts, and Patrick Perry, who's here at the table, and Marcia Hirano Nakanishi, who's in the audience, are really the two experts of others that have already been talking about how do we make this transition, and have been directly involved with this JPA that Karen mentioned to you earlier. But there are also long-term issues, which you've started to talk about today, that we think you should consider as we move ahead. And here are a few. They're just ideas. They're not the sole list or the only list. What role can a coordinating body play in implementation and oversight of the state's goals and objectives for higher education? How do we tap into policy and analytical expertise that might not be available within the new organization? Is there a way to take advantage of such experts to the benefit of the state and the system that isn't just through existing personnel? What role can the roundtable and the Intersegmental Coordinating Council play to assist in coordination and collaboration? Certainly that is an ongoing work. K-12 is a part of that. The superintendent, of course, is a member of that roundtable. They're scheduled to meet here in about 6 weeks again. And certainly I can point to several initiatives that have come out of that work that didn't come out from legislation or from a budget or from CPEC. What do we need today versus what we thought we needed over 3 decades ago or 2 decades ago. And I think the focus is a key to that, as well as the capacity, not only analytical, but the leadership. Eligibility studies, for example, are very important for all of us, but they're not done every year. And how we approach getting those done, is something that you should think about in the context of what you really want to focus CPEC 2.0 on. In the end, our conclusion and common advice is simple. Create a higher education agenda with statewide goals and objectives. Find leaders that can help us all focus on the collective results we want. And establish a system that provides transparency and accountability for all of us for the outcomes that we want to achieve. With that, Madam Chair, I'm going to complete my portion of this presentation and happy to answer questions or defer to my colleagues.
Senator Liu, I'm Jonathan Brown, the president of the Independent Colleges. I have a unique position at this table because I was present when Section 1202 was written in federal law in 1972.
You're old.
I am old. I was a staffer for both a senator and a U.S. congressman at the time. So I know, and I think Ames's discussion, my good friend Ames' discussion is correct. I think what he understated in the discussion about the Kentucky experience is the integration of a couple of different sectors. The business community, and my colleague who runs the association in Kentucky and I have had some long discussions about coordination. Kentucky is a great example, and we ought to look over the Sierra once to see at least what's happening in some other states. What happened was that the business community, that's all right, the business community especially said Kentucky is not going to go forward in the economy that the U.S. is experiencing right now. And some major business leaders and political leaders and civic leaders got together and said this is a priority, not unlike the initial discussions in the late 50s, and I wasn't there for that, but the initial discussions for the master plan for higher education. And then after they began to raise that set of questions, then the political elements really got into it. And the political structure that ultimately came about as a result of civic and business and governmental discussions before that. But I think what they did was try and establish some long-term broad goals. We've chosen in California in the independent sector to stay out of the student database because, quite frankly, we couldn't understand how it was going to be used and whether student data privacy was going to be protected, and some other issues that we had some concerns about. That doesn't mean we aren't interested in figuring out how to coordinate and how to use all the resources of higher education to solve this problem. PPIC said roughly a year and a half or 2 years ago that we're probably 1 million degrees short in the next 15 years.
Correct.
And, I've said several times before this committee and others, I don't want to live in Mississippi with earthquakes. It's not a place that I want my grandchildren to grow up in. So I think the focus of this hearing has been superb. I think this is a tough problem. I think the independent sector and the 4 segments, part of the reason we decided to ask Karen to speak for all of us was because I think we recognize that this is a critical function for the state, and we stand ready to try and work with it to make it work.
Thank you. Thank you.
Todd Greenspan with the University of California. I'm the Director of Academic Planning. Basically, we agree with everything that's been said. I think it's a critical time for the future of higher education. I mean, if you look at the size of the cuts to UC, CSU, and the community colleges, you have to go back to, I think, 1933 in the heart of the Great Depression for a single-year cut as large as we've taken this year. And so I think a function of any coordinating body or entity or process needs to be to kind of what Ames McGinnis was talking about, getting the citizenry, the public, the legislature, the governor focused on the need for adequate investment in higher education and just making people aware of the direction we're headed. And I don't think people really recognize the magnitude of what we've done recently.
Thank you.
Good afternoon, Patrick Perry. I'm the Vice Chancellor for Technology, Research, and Information Systems at the Chancellor's Office. And I'm going to talk on the data issues, both for the short-term and the long-term aspect of what's just occurred. So CPEC had established itself as a unit record repository of higher ed data, and actually recently they had begun doing data matches with K-12. So they were starting to act in a pretty wide space, which was something that we all needed and recognized was useful. We do have some decision points about what happens with this data. I want to separate out data and reports, because CPEC does have 50 years worth of reports out there, and they're generally static. And so as far as reports like that, an entity like maybe the California State Library or Archives might be a good place to put all of that prior work so that it's not lost. The data itself sits on a disk, and they are governed by FERPA, and they currently are of the domain of the community colleges, the UC and the CSU unit record systems, and they go back 10 years and beyond. And they can only be disclosed to an authorized educational entity, which is what Karen had mentioned before. So really the choices seem to be assign it to another educational entity that is FERPA compliant to accept it, or destroy the data, which is one option. It's not our preferred option. Know full well that if in the end that occurs, all the segments actually still do have the data in their respective data silos. So it could be recreated, and all the ancillary data and supplemental things that CPEC has collected over the years could be recreated and reassembled. However, assignment of stewardship of this data has been a topic of discussion amongst us here recently, since this has occurred. And we have been discussing data stewardship of a K through 20 data entity and data warehouse since the passage of SB 1298. Right. And currently we are in the process of routing an interagency agreement that all of the segments have agreed to, as far as how do we both collect and securely store and use K through 20 data. And this also includes CDE and their ever-maturing data warehouse as well. Unfortunately, CPEC was set to be a major player in this, so losing them is not a good thing. But the segments are continuing on this path, and the interagency agreement is just about completed now. We're awaiting on the outcome of Senator Simidian's SB 885, which would encourage us to take that interagency agreement and move it forward into a full joint powers authority, which is the preferred governance method that came out of the LAO-run SB 1298 work group. So that's something that the segments already really can agree on, and we do want to pursue that, and that we think that bill, if signed by the governor, will send us a very nice, strong signal to go ahead and continue on down that path. Ultimately, we think that's the proper endpoint for this data. As far as assigning it on the interim, we, the segments, actually think that if you give us a little time, we can, amongst ourselves, come up with an adequate storage location for it in the meantime, more than likely using our own resources. I mean, we all have data centers. We probably might not be able to do nearly as much work with it on the interim as, a funded entity like CPEC might, but keeping it contiguous would be something that we can probably handle on the interim. Okay? And that's all I had to say.
Okay, thank you. Any questions, Senator? It's just serving this. Okay. What about, there are two things we asked you to look at, too, is about new program review and new campus approvals, or absent CPEC. What do you think ought to be assigned, or who ought to be assigned to do these duties?
Want to go in reverse order?
Sure.
Okay, so CPEC currently does review and approve the establishment of new community college centers. However, this is a process that begins at the Chancellor's office already and has a pretty well-established path, both through our office and ultimately to our Board of Governors, which is a public process. It's a lengthy process, and so this is something that our Chancellor feels that we can continue doing or take on completely within the confines of the Board.
You do that out of whose needs?
Well, I mean, that's a very viable question.
Just determine that the community decides they want to have a campus, and they gather around and sign a petition and submit it to you guys, and you determine whether or not you can do this and come to the state for funding?
Actually, in our own system, it's a lengthier process. It has to be already part of an existing community college that establishes a certain threshold of FTES to meet it, because,
right.
creating a new center.
But let's go back. I mean, the question is, state need. Does it address?
Right.
If the state doesn't articulate a need, how do we know that,
Senator, I'll speak to that. I've had the opposite experience.
Okay.
I've had the opposite experience of having bills introduced telling us that we're going to open a center in a particular community,
Right.
and we've had to work hard to convince people that that's not the right way to go about doing it either. I think that what we're talking about when we talk about coordination versus regulation is, I think having goals and objectives, and frankly, using this entity to hold us accountable is still the right way. Governing boards are accountable to you. Governing boards are operating in a public setting. And frankly, that's part of the job of all of us as it relates to accountability here. I'm not convinced that CPEC did that, and I'm not sure that I would second guess a governing board. At that point, I think we have a conversation about general governance of higher education. That's
Right.
a bigger question.
It's a much bigger question.
But certainly it's a pretty thorough review, and we have a set criteria that our board adopts publicly. It's in Title V. You have to meet those, so forth and so on. I think if you asked Chancellor Reed, he would be undoing centers that we have, because frankly we've never been funded for them. So, I don't think anybody's racing out to do that. I think program is a legitimate one in the sense of, are we tracking the programs to workforce needs? Absolutely. That is something I think a CPEC 2.0 should be looking at in the big picture, not in the incremental piece of the institutions. But that's just me.
And Senator, I guess I would say, as somebody who's watched the process for both program review and new site review over all the history of CPEC, I think they've done some absolutely stunningly good research. When the Irvine Law School was done, they had done a series of really good pieces of work that said that the state had plenty of lawyers, and that there were plenty of opportunities to get a legal education and things like that. So I think the broader question that Karen's statement, or our joint statement, suggests is that first you've got to get a clearer understanding of goals, and then because in fact ultimately some of the best pieces of research that CPEC did in this area, the legislature just steamrolled over them. So if you get clear on goals, if you basically say what is the interest of the state in a particular area, then the research is going to be more dispositive than it has been in the past 20 or 30 years.
Do you think we can get a majority vote on that, Alan?
From the perspective of the University of California, I was just going to say we have a pretty rigorous internal review process for approval of new graduate programs. It's our academic senate has a set of criteria, and we've actually matched them up to the CPEC criteria. There's obviously some overlap, but there's obviously some things that the CPEC looks at on behalf of the state about need. However, I think this is one of the changes this whole hearing today has been talking about, that the rate of change in higher education is such that disciplinary changes, things like that, are happening at such a rapid rate on campuses that it's really, so if we're talking about sort of individual degree titles or particular graduate programs, CPEC does their best, but they really don't have the staff nor the expertise to keep up with that. So in some sense, there has to be an organic process. And then I'm thinking, if you're getting to the really big issues like the creation of a new campus, a new medical school, something that's going to require significant state resources, And I think what we were describing is that there's ways you could create processes where you bring in outside experts to review that. For example, I think people are forgetting on the law school that actually UC proposed 2 law schools in 2000, one at Riverside, one at Irvine. CPEC basically said that there wasn't the need. We went back to the drawing board. We created an expert panel internally that included judges, people from the outside, picked one of those 2 proposals, came back to the state. So, I mean, there was a give and take. It wasn't just this one proposal came forward, and there wasn't a give and take with the state about what the needs were. And then lastly, of course, it's a lot harder to have this conversation about state approval of programs when a lot of our new programs are not being funded by the state, and that kind of gets back to my initial point.
Correct. Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. We have a few minutes left over for public comment. If anyone would like to make a public comment. I don't see anybody rushing the microphone. So, Senator Lowenthal, I thank you for joining the conversation.
Thank you.
Things to think about quickly.
Yeah, I think one of the things that really comes to mind is this idea that, you know, we really have to, I think it was pointed out, look beyond the Sierras. I mean, it is really important that as we move forward with any kind of replacement or something for CPEC, that we really, I think the message was clear from everyone that there are models out there, that there are ways in which there's a balance between the integrity of each institution and really having overall state goals and a vision for where we want, what we want, and having that input come into the system, not just among ourselves, but to have something that really is connected to really where we're going as a state, and that it helps impact the legislature and the governor, and that's a very interesting time, and especially at a time when there's such distrust on all institutions, and
Right.
especially the legislature, and people are wondering whether any institution works or not.
Correct. Okay. Well, I thank all the participants this afternoon, and we will have a follow-up conversation with some of you, and it'll be open to the public for your input, and we'll call it a day.
Good.
Thanks.